As we're completing the Hrushevsky translation project, I frequently think of the thoughts of John Armstrong, a political scientist, who said that for the Ukrainian national movement, for Ukrainian political life, the history of Ukraine-Rus by Mikhailo Hrushevsky was one of the most important and convincing proofs that Ukrainians are a nation and a people. This comes to mind as well because, of course, there are circles that still question whether Ukrainians are a nation. We need only look at Vladimir Putin, who not only has claimed Anna Yaroslavna as somehow belonging to Russia, but who has insisted that Ukrainians and Russians belong to one nation. That is, although we are long away from the period when Ukrainians attempted to establish their first modern state, a process that Mikhailo Hrushevsky was so important in, that is 100 years ago. And we are long away from the period of Ukrainian independence of 25 or 26 years ago. We still find circles not only in Russia and those who listen to Putin, but even in Western academia, who question, are Ukrainians really a nation or a people? We even saw this during the Maidan, that even in societies such as Germany, which had long operated under what might be called anti-national or anti-nationalist vision of very respectable scholars saying, well, should Ukrainians really have the right to an independent state? Do they have their own language, culture, and history? And in that, I think it shows us to what degree Hrushevsky still speaks important lessons to a wider community, and above all, wrote a masterful history of Ukraine that goes down to the middle of the 17th century. That relates to this project that I've been involved in for many, many years. That is not only supervising the translation of Hrushevsky into English, but in some way making Hrushevsky accessible to an international community. That has meant providing a full scholarly apparatus and bibliographies for Hrushevsky's works, things that he was unable to do during his own lifetime, providing scholarly introductions, discussions of Hrushevsky, discussing literature that came out after Hrushevsky, to ensure that Hrushevsky and the tremendous work he did, not only in the collection but also the interpretation of material, still can speak to a generation of historians that are 100 years distant from Hrushevsky in time. Well, where did the project come about? I think that it's always important to talk about origins. This, of course, was what Hrushevsky wanted to do. He wanted to have his history translated into an international language. Indeed, he, and Ivan Franko was a collaborator in this, initiated the publication of Volume 1 into German, published in 1906 in Leipzig. It was really the point where the international scholarly community began to pay attention to Hrushevsky. That is, when Hrushevsky's work came out not in a Slavic language, but in an international scholarly language. And during his life, he even talked with people in Canada about having it translated into English. And indeed, the Shevchenko Scientific Society, after World War II in New York, began to translate these volumes, although they didn't really have the resources, both financial, but also in terms of translators and above all of scholars who could really deal with Hrushevsky's text. So this was a project that had long been thought about, and it was a project that Mr. Peter Yatzik, a Toronto developer, patriot of Ukraine, wanted to see done. I was not at CIUS when the project began, but I understand the director then, Bogdan Kravchenko, visited Warsaw, where he discussed with Professor Zbigniew Wójcik, the great specialist of the Cossack period, the idea of translating Hrushevsky into English. And Professor Wójcik is said to have replied, had we Poles such a great historian, we would have arranged his translation into English. Now, I would like to, it's a shame that Professor Wójcik passed away not long ago, and I never got a chance to ask him if indeed he did say that. But I think what it also tells us is the importance Ukrainian studies in North America had achieved by the late 1980s to a considerable degree in the study of the medieval and early modern period, and that was centered largely at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, where Professors Omelyan Pritsak and Ihor Shevchenko had believed that in order to ensure that Ukrainian studies would develop, they had to show that Ukraine was just more than a momentary modern event. That is, that Ukraine was only a 20th century issue, and that Ukraine had deep historical roots. And they, of course, were very successful, particularly in the study of the early Rus period, but also with the school that they formed with the study of early modern Ukrainian history. I think one of the indications of this comes from one of the contributors to our Hrushevsky volume, Dr. Paul Hollingsworth, who was a graduate student at Berkeley when the Harvard experiment was going on, and said that he and his professors had conceived of Kiev in Russia. But as he began to read the material coming out of Harvard, he more and more understood that this was Rus and that this was an entity which had given birth to modern Ukraine. This, I think, permeated the field at that time. I know at our first launch of the first Hrushevsky volume, Professor Thomas Noonan, the great numismatist from University of Minnesota, had said he only wished when he had studied or when he had been training graduate students earlier that he would have had the translation of Hrushevsky, that there were already translations of the Russian historians Solovyov and Hrushevsky with their view, and he thought it was important that students should understand Hrushevsky's view. So that gives us an idea of where this tradition came from, how the project as it was established in Edmonton took root, and how CIUS came to undertake this massive undertaking. And I think few realized there, as they began it, quite how large one it would be. Indeed, in its initial stage, when I came to CIUS, I was fortunate that Professor Andrzej Pope of the University of Warsaw was willing to work with us at putting out the first very complicated volume, a volume where Hrushevsky cites over 1,700 different items of sources or scholarly literature, and that we had to trace down all of these items and see them diviso, that is, to follow their bibliographic, their citation correctness. We were fortunate that our Warsaw colleagues helped us in that initial phase, but really it's hard for me to conceive of how we would have finished the project had Ukraine not become independent and had we not been able to work with scholars, particularly in Lviv and in Kyiv, who were interested in Hrushevsky, who wanted to study this, and who were able to work with us on the tremendous search we had to carry on, looking for all of the literature and sources Hrushevsky used, tracing down the veracity of citations, looking for subsequent literature. I think particularly of the group at the Institute of Archaeography around Professor Miran Kapral and how important they were for our project. Now, as the volumes came out, and they came out, of course, as we finished the work, so many of the Cossack volumes came out earlier. That is the second great period in Ukrainian history, according to Hrushevsky, and the third cycle of the history of Ukrainian literature. We also began to understand how important English would be for reaching a wider public. Because we did tremendous work on the Turkic and Tatar elements of Ukrainian past, we soon saw that many specialists in Ottoman history were interested in our work, that those who studied Balkan history were. Recently, we sent a full set to the Yorga Institute in Bucharest. Nicolae Yorga is the great Romanian historian, roughly contemporary of Hrushevsky, much respected by Romanian historiography, a Ukrainian national, and some would say nationalist historian. Well, that group, of course, vitally wanted the English volumes of Hrushevsky because they do not read Ukrainian. And even though Romanian and particularly Moldovan old culture and Ukrainian culture are so closely connected, any of us who have seen the so-called Volosska Tserkva in Lviv realize how close these connections were, the so-called Wallachian or Moldavian church. in Lviv shows how close the cultures were. So we could see that the Hrushevsky project, its products, were going far beyond the group who only studies East Central Europe. I really thought of the importance of this when I was just in Kyiv, where in last year, which was the 150th anniversary of Hrushevsky's birth, an international conference on Hrushevsky was held, partially at the Hrushevsky Museum in Kyiv. And one had dozens of scholars working on Hrushevsky with whom one could discuss and criticize and understand both the person and his contribution to Ukrainian history. And one thing they said that really struck me, they said that when they had first gathered 25 years ago, they knew very little about Hrushevsky. And they were looking to his text only to find truth, understanding of self. And now as they look back, they understood how really the study of Hrushevsky had opened up to them new historical methods, new criticisms, new ways of understanding, as they had been able finally to develop in an atmosphere of frequent Ukrainian historiography. And then I think one of the most pleasant moments for me was when they said that they're putting out 50 volumes of all of Hrushevsky's works, and now when they begin to publish the Historia Ukraine-Rus, the history of Ukraine-Rus in Ukrainian original, they will be taking much of the bibliographic and research work done for the English translation and to be applying it to the Ukrainian original. So in that way, we can see this symbiosis of those traditions. And of course, Hrushevsky is particularly important at the moment because of the political ramifications of Hrushevsky. Hrushevsky, after all, was the first head of an independent Ukrainian state. Hrushevsky, tremendously important for understanding the establishment of the modern Ukrainian state in 1917. And so as attention is once again focused to those events, Hrushevsky comes to the fore. I particularly felt that when I went to an international conference in Cholm, now the Polish city of Helm, the city where Hrushevsky was born. He was only lived there for 2.5 years. The city is now in Poland. It's, of course, well known to Ukrainians, particularly because of the Holy Mountain and the apparitions of the Mother of God in the city of Cholm. It's a city very important for Ukrainian historical experience. It was the city founded by Danilo Halitsky, Danilo of Galicia. This was to be his capital. It was a great city from that mount. And right now there are tremendous archaeographic excavations going on in the city. But at the moment, it also becomes involved with new tensions in Polish-Ukrainian relations. Indeed, even those Poles, some Polish scholars, and much more Polish politicians, who now look at all criticisms Hrushevsky made of the Polish influence in Ukrainian past as somehow an assault on Polish identity. We were able to have a wonderful international conference there, and there are many Polish scholars who are deeply interested in Hrushevsky. But we also must understand that Hrushevsky, his theses on Ukrainian history, and his political activities continue to be centers of controversy, not only from the side of Russia and Putin, but also from Poland and some of Ukraine's neighbors. Yet, when I was in Poland, I also took part in some fantastic discussions that were held in the Polish National Theater, the Teatr Polski, on Hrushevsky, where the Polish intelligentsia came to. Extremely important. But what was the most phenomenal for me understanding is that today, if Polish students are going to read Hrushevsky, they are not going to read the Ukrainian original. They cannot read the Ukrainian original, but they can read the English translation. So even in the years we have worked on the project, the change of international scholarly relations above all, the expansion of English to an international scholarly language has meant that through this project, we are able to bring Hrushevsky back to a international scholarly community that stretches from Peking to Edmonton. And so, from this project formed in Edmonton, I might add a city where once what we now call the St. John's Institute was originally called the Hrushevsky Institute. We have been really able to introduce Hrushevsky at a very crucial moment back into the discussion, at a time when, indeed, as the Ukrainian state attempts to defend its sovereignty, as an international campaign is conducted by the various trolls and groups that are financed by Russia, having an authoritative history of Ukraine that shows that Ukraine is more than just a 20th century or 21st century phenomenon is all the more important. And in that way, although we have emphasized the scholarly nature of our project, we can see it has broad ramifications. Thank you.